The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the backyard of my parents' sprawling suburban home. It was late afternoon on the day of the pool party, a gathering that had been planned for weeks and promised to be one of those lazy summer afternoons where time seemed to stretch endlessly. The air smelled faintly of chlorine from the freshly cleaned pool, mingling with the sweet tang of grilled pineapple wafting from the kitchen. I sat cross-legged on the edge of a lounge chair, absently scrolling through my phone while trying to ignore the knot of unease tightening in my chest. This wasn't just any pool party. It was an annual tradition, something my dad insisted on hosting every year as a way to reconnect with old friends and family members who rarely cross paths otherwise. For most people, it was probably harmless fun, laughter echoing off the water, kids splashing around, adults lounging under umbrellas with cold drinks in hand. But for me, these events always carried an undercurrent of dread. There were too many eyes watching, too many questions about what I'd been up to lately, too much pressure to appear like I had everything figured out when in reality, I felt anything but .at24 I should have been thriving, or at least pretending to. Instead, I spent most days stuck in a fog of self-doubt and restlessness. My job as a junior graphic designer paid the bills, but left me feeling creatively stifled. And my social life consisted mostly of half-hearted texts exchanged with college friends who were all busy building lives I couldn't quite imagine for myself. Even worse, there was the gnawing sense that I was hiding parts of myself. Not just from others, but sometimes even from me. Being gay wasn't something I openly talked about, not because I feared outright rejection, my parents were progressive enough, but because admitting it aloud meant confronting everything else that came with it: vulnerability, judgment, longing. And so, I kept quiet, burying those feelings beneath layers of distraction and routine. As I scrolled past another meme-filled group chat, my gaze drifted toward the driveway, where cars were beginning to pull in. The first wave of guests had arrived: cousins, neighbors, colleagues of my parents, and their voices carried over the fence, bright and cheerful. Among them would be him, Ethan, my father's best friend since before I was born. He was one of those rare constants in our lives, someone whose presence felt both comforting and suffocating depending on the day. Ethan was unlike anyone else I knew. Tall and broad-shouldered, with perpetually tanned skin and laugh lines etched deep into his face, he exuded a kind of effortless charm that made people gravitate toward him. His confidence bordered on magnetic, yet there was also something guarded about him, a flicker of intensity behind his easy smile that hinted at depths few bothered to explore. Growing up, I'd idolized him in ways I didn't fully understand, admiring how effortlessly he navigated the world, how he could command a room without saying a word. But now, as an adult, seeing him stirred something more complicated within me, a mix of nostalgia, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. Today, though, none of that mattered. All I wanted was to get through this party without drawing attention to myself, to blend into the background like I usually did, sipping soda by the snack table or floating aimlessly in the shallow end until everyone forgot I was there. What I didn't know then was that today wouldn't go according to plan. Not even close, because moments later, as Ethan stepped into view carrying a cooler filled with ice-cold beers, our eyes met across the yard, and suddenly, nothing felt safe anymore. The moment Ethan caught my eye, I felt my stomach drop. He paused mid-stride, tilting his head slightly as if studying me, and then broke into that familiar grin, the one that used to make me feel seen, understood, even special. Now, it only served to heighten my discomfort. "Hey, kid," he called out, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation and laughter. The nickname stung more than usual today, maybe because I no longer felt like a child, but hadn't yet earned the right to call myself anything else that I forced a smile and waved back awkwardly, my fingers gripping the edge of the lounge chair tighter. "Hey, Ethan," I replied, injecting as much casualness into my tone as possible. But inside, my thoughts were racing. Why did he always have to show up looking so put together? His dark hair was tousled just enough to look intentional, and his fitted polo shirt clung to his frame in a way that left little to the imagination. It shouldn't have mattered. He was practically family, but somehow it did. Before I could retreat further into my shell, Ethan strode over, setting the cooler down beside me with a soft thud. "You're hiding again," he said, his tone teasing but laced with something sharper, almost knowing. "Come on, don't tell me you're still shy around your old man's friends." "I'm not hiding," I muttered, though we both knew it was a lie. My gaze darted toward the pool, where a group of kids were shrieking and splashing each other, hoping to distract myself from the weight of his scrutiny. When I glanced back, Ethan was crouched beside me, his forearms resting on his knees. Up close, he smelled faintly of sunscreen and cologne, a combination that hit me harder than it should have. "You sure about that?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. His hazel eyes sparkled with amusement, but there was a flicker of something deeper there too, something I couldn't quite place. Was it concern? Curiosity? Or was I reading too much into it, projecting my own insecurities onto him? I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. Just taking a breather. You know how these things can get overwhelming. Ethan chuckled softly, leaning back on his heels. "Yeah, Ido. But you're missing out. Everyone's having a good time." He gestured toward the chaos unfolding around us. My mom laughing as she flipped burgers on the grill, my dad engaged in an animated debate with Uncle Greg, and a cluster of teenagers attempting, and failing, to execute a synchronized cannonball. Despite myself, I found my lips twitching upward at the absurdity of it all. "Not really my scene," I admitted, fiddling with the hem of my t-shirt. "Besides, I think I've aged out of pool parties." "Oh, come on," Ethan said, nudging my foot playfully with his own. "You're what, 24? That's prime pool party age. Trust me, you haven't aged out of anything yet." His words hung between us, light and teasing on the surface, but carrying an undertone that made my pulse quicken. I swallowed hard, searching for a response that wouldn't betray how flustered I suddenly felt. "Easy for you to say. You're—" I trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence without sounding ridiculous. "Older? More confident? Perfectly comfortable in your own skin, me?" Ethan prompted, leaning closer. His proximity sent a jolt through me, and I instinctively leaned back, nearly tipping off the lounge chair. He steadied me with a hand on my arm, his touch firm but gentle. "What about me?" "Nothing," I mumbled, heat flooding my cheeks. "Forget it." He didn't let it go. "No, seriously. What were you going to say?" For a split second, I considered telling him the truth. That he seemed untouchable, larger than life, someone who existed in a realm I could never access. But instead, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "You're just better at this stuff than I am." Ethan tilted his head, studying me intently. "Better at what? Small talk? Parties? Life in general?" There was a playful lilt to his voice, but his expression softened, becoming unexpectedly earnest. "Look, I get it. These things aren't for everyone. But you don't have to fake it, okay? Just be yourself." The sincerity in his words caught me off guard. It wasn't the first time he'd offered advice like this. It was part of what made him such a beloved figure in our circle. But hearing it now, directed at me, felt different. Like he saw something in me that no one else did, not even myself. And maybe that's why I couldn't bring myself to look away. Even as my heart hammered against my ribs, that we sat there for a beat longer than necessary, the noise of the party fading into white noise around us. Finally, Ethan stood, brushing imaginary dirt off his hands. "All right, enough existential crisis for one day. How about we grab a beer and join the madness? Unless you're still determined to sit here and brood." "I don't brood," I protested weakly, though the corner of his mouth quirking upward told me he didn't believe me. "Sure you don't," he teased, extending a hand to help me up. Against my better judgment, I took it, letting him pull me to my feet. His grip lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and when I finally met his gaze, I saw something flicker there, something unspoken, something electric, and just like that, the tension shifted. Whatever fragile boundary had existed between us moments ago dissolved, replaced by a charged energy that left me breathless. As Ethan led the way toward the cooler, chatting easily about nothing in particular, I couldn't shake the feeling that this day was about to change everything. As Ethan handed me a cold bottle of beer, the condensation dripping down my fingers, I tried to focus on the chatter around us. My cousin Mia was recounting her latest travel mishap: a missed flight, a lost suitcase, and a hotel clerk who spoke zero English. But her words blurred into the background as I struggled to reconcile the man standing beside me with the version of him I'd built up in my head. This wasn't the same Ethan who'd ruffle my hair as a kid or taught me how to throw a football in the backyard. This Ethan was different, sharper, more present, and yet, somehow, exactly the same. "So, how's work treating you these days?" Ethan asked, popping the cap off his own beer with practiced ease. His question was casual, but the way he looked at me, as if genuinely interested in the answer, made my throat tighten. "It's fine," I said, shrugging. "Same old grind. Deadlines, client meetings, endless revisions." I hesitated, glancing down at the label on my bottle. "Honestly, it's not really what I thought it would be." Ethan nodded slowly, his brow furrowing slightly. "Yeah, I remember that phase. Feeling like you're stuck in neutral while everyone else is speeding ahead." His words struck a chord, and I glanced up sharply. "How did you deal with it?" A small, wry smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "By making some bad decisions, mostly. But eventually, I figured out that growth doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes you just need to give yourself permission to stumble." There was wisdom in his tone, a quiet authority that resonated deeply. Yet, beneath it lay a shadow, a hint of regret or unresolved pain that he didn't elaborate on. I wanted to ask more, to pry open the cracks in his armor and see what lay hidden underneath, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of overstepping, or maybe it was the realization that Ethan's complexities mirrored my own in ways I wasn't ready to confront. The conversation shifted seamlessly to lighter topics. His recent hiking trip, the new restaurant downtown that he swore had the best tacos in town, but the undercurrent remained. Every shared laugh, every lingering glance felt weighted with meaning. When Mia excused herself to refill her plate, leaving us alone once again, the silence between us grew thicker, charged with unspoken possibilities. "You ever think about taking a break?" Ethan asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "From work, I mean. Go somewhere, clear your head." I blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. "Like a vacation? Or just space?" He clarified, his voice softer now. "Sometimes stepping away helps you figure out what you really want." His gaze bore into mine, searching, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if he was talking about more than just my career. Did he sense the turmoil brewing inside me? Could he tell that I was holding pieces of myself back, afraid to let anyone see the full picture? The idea unsettled me, but also sparked a flicker of hope, a tiny ember of possibility that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as invisible as I convinced myself I was. But before I could respond, the spell was broken. Someone called Ethan's name from across the yard, and he turned instinctively, flashing a quick smile before turning back to me. "Think about it," he said simply, patting my shoulder lightly before walking away. I watched him go. My chest tightened with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt exposed, as if he'd peeled back layers of my carefully constructed facade without even trying. On the other, there was a strange comfort in being seen, in knowing that someone might understand the tangled web of doubts and desires I carried within me. It was then that I realized whatever was happening between us wasn't just surface-level attraction. It ran deeper, rooted in years of shared history and unspoken connection. And as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force drawing me closer to him, even as logic screamed at me to stay away. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the party transitioned into its twilight phase, I found myself lingering near the pool, staring at the shimmering surface of the water. The lights strung above cast a kaleidoscope of colors across the ripples, creating an almost hypnotic effect. Around me, the atmosphere had shifted. The earlier chaos had mellowed into a quieter, more intimate vibe. Couples whispered conspiratorially in corners, while others lounged lazily on inflatable rafts, their laughter punctuated by occasional splashes. It was the kind of scene that felt designed to lower inhibitions, to blur boundaries, and I hated how acutely aware I was of every detail. Ethan reappeared at my side, seemingly out of nowhere, holding 2 fresh beers. He handed me one without asking, his movements fluid and unhurried. Still avoiding the deep end? He joked, nodding toward the pool. I prefer solid ground, I replied, forcing a smile. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, though my grip on the bottle betrayed my unease. The weight of his presence pressed against me, tangible and undeniable, and I fought the urge to step back, to create distance between us. Instead, I stayed rooted in place, hyper-aware of the warmth radiating off his body, the faint scent of salt water clinging to his skin. That He chuckled softly, leaning casually against the railing that encircled the pool. Fair enough. Some people are just better suited for the shallows. His comment landed with an odd resonance, as if he were speaking in code. Was he referring to me? To himself? Or was I reading too much into it, projecting my own anxieties onto his words? I opened my mouth to respond, but the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted us. It was Sarah, a family friend who'd known Ethan nearly as long as I had. She greeted him warmly, looping her arm through his with an ease that made my stomach churn. "Ethan, I was wondering where you disappeared to," she said, her tone teasing. "Don't tell me you've been monopolizing poor Alex all evening." "Guilty as charged," Ethan replied with a grin, shooting me a sidelong glance. "But hey, someone's got to keep him entertained." Sarah laughed, her gaze flicking between us before settling on me. "Well, don't hog him too long. We need reinforcements for charades later." With that, she wandered off, leaving behind a trail of perfume and an awkward silence. I stared down at the beer in my hand, suddenly hyper-focused on the condensation pooling at the base of the bottle. Ethan cleared his throat, shifting his weight slightly. "She's right, you know. You should join in. It'll be fun." "Maybe," I murmured, though the thought of participating in anything remotely social made my skin crawl. Fun wasn't the word I'd use to describe the growing tension coiled tightly in my chest. Fun didn't account for the way my pulse quickened whenever Ethan brushed against me, however accidentally. Fun certainly didn't explain why I couldn't stop replaying his earlier comments in my mind, dissecting them for hidden meanings. "You okay?" Ethan asked after a pause, his voice softer now, tinged with concern. "You seem distracted." "I'm fine," I lied, forcing another smile. "Just tired, I guess." He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he reached out, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder. The contact sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric, and I froze, unable to move or breathe. His touch was brief, barely more than a second, but it lingered long after he pulled away, branding itself into my consciousness. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know," he said quietly, his eyes locking onto mine. "Whatever's going on in that head of yours, you can talk to me." His words were simple, straightforward, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. Because buried beneath the surface of his offer was a truth I couldn't ignore. Ethan saw me. Really saw me. Not the mask I wore for everyone else, but the raw, unfiltered version of myself that I worked so hard to conceal. And as much as I wanted to trust him, to let him in, the fear of what might happen if I did paralyzed me. "I appreciate that," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not sure I'm ready to unpack everything just yet." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his gaze. "Whenever you are, I'll be here." The sincerity in his tone undid me. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked rapidly, willing them away. I wanted to believe him, to take solace in the promise of his support, but doubt gnawed at me relentlessly. What if opening up only led to rejection? What if the connection I felt was one-sided, imagined, or worse, misinterpreted? The questions swirled endlessly, each one pulling me deeper into a vortex of uncertainty. And yet, despite the turmoil raging inside me, there was a part of me that refused to let go entirely. A stubborn, irrational sliver of hope that whispered, maybe, just maybe, this could be real. The crowd began to thin as the evening stretched on, the once bustling backyard now bathed in the soft glow of string lights. The air carried a coolness that hinted at the approaching night, and the distant hum of cicadas blended with the occasional splash from the pool. Most of the guests had retreated indoors or gathered around the fire pit, leaving only a handful of stragglers scattered across the patio. It was during this lull, when the world seemed to exhale and slow down, that Ethan suggested we take a walk. Need a break from the noise? He asked, inclining his head toward the garden path that wound around the property. His tone was casual, but there was a deliberate softness to his voice, as if he were gauging my reaction before committing fully. That I hesitated, glancing toward the house where the remnants of the party lingered. The idea of stepping away felt risky, like crossing an invisible line, but the pull of solitude, coupled with the chance to be alone with him, outweighed my reservations. Sure, I said finally, setting my empty beer bottle on the nearest table. Why not? We started down the path, the gravel crunching softly beneath our feet. The garden was dimly lit, the shadows of towering hedges and blooming flowers stretching long in the twilight. Fireflies danced lazily in the air, their golden flickers casting fleeting halos around us. For a while, neither of us spoke, content to let the quiet envelop us. The absence of conversation felt natural, almost companionable, but it also heightened my awareness of every movement, every breath. You've always liked this part of the yard, Ethan remarked after a moment, breaking the silence. He gestured vaguely toward the rose bushes lining the path, their petals heavy with dew. Remember when you used to hide out here during family dinners? Said the adults talked too much. I laughed softly, the memory surfacing like an old photograph. Yeah, I thought I was being clever. Turns out, everyone knew exactly where I was. Your dad used to send me out to find you, Ethan added, a fond smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Said I had a better shot at coaxing you back inside than he did. That's because you bribed me with dessert, I countered, shaking my head. Hardly fair tactics. Hey, desperate times call for desperate measures, he quipped, his grin widening. Besides, it worked, didn't it? It was a light-hearted exchange, but beneath the banter lay an unspoken acknowledgement of how well he knew me. Even then, when I was just a kid too shy to sit at the grown-ups' table. The realization settled heavily in my chest, amplifying the tension that had been simmering all evening. I shoved my hands into my pockets, focusing on the rhythmic crunch of gravel to steady myself. The path curved sharply, leading us to a secluded bench tucked beneath an ancient oak tree. Its branches stretched wide, forming a canopy that shielded us from the rest of the world. Ethan gestured for me to sit, and after a brief hesitation, I complied. He lowered himself onto the bench beside me, leaving a respectful gap between us, though the air still crackled with unspoken energy. This spot hasn't changed much, he observed, leaning back and gazing up at the stars peeking through the leaves. Feels like a lifetime ago since we last sat here. Feels like yesterday, I murmured, my voice barely audible. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted their honesty. But Ethan didn't react with surprise or discomfort. Instead, he turned his head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. What's different now? He asked, his tone measured but probing. About you, I mean. The question caught me off guard, its simplicity masking its depth. I opened my mouth to deflect, to offer some vague, non-committal response, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was no judgment there, no expectation, just genuine curiosity, a willingness to listen. And for reasons I couldn't fully articulate, I decided to answer him honestly. Everything, I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. I'm not the same person I was back then. I don't even know who I am half the time. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. That's normal, you know. Growing up changes you. Hell, life changes you. But sometimes, I think we forget to check in with ourselves along the way. His words resonated deeply, striking a chord I hadn't realized needed striking. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's version of your life? Like you're playing a role instead of actually living? He let out a low chuckle, though it lacked humor. More often than I'd like to admit. People expect certain things from me, my family, my friends, even myself. Sometimes it feels like I'm wearing a mask I can't take off. The admission startled me. In all the years I'd known him, Ethan had always seemed so self-assured, so unshakable. Hearing him confess to doubts and insecurities humanized him in a way I hadn't anticipated. It also bridged the gap between us, making him feel less like an untouchable figure and more like someone real. "And what about you?" he asked, turning the question back on me. "Do you wear a mask too?" I hesitated, my fingers tracing absent patterns on the bench. "Yeah," I admitted quietly, "but mine's heavier, harder to breathe in." Ethan didn't press for details, and I was grateful for that. Instead, he shifted slightly, angling his body toward mine. "You don't have to carry it forever, you know. Masks are meant to come off eventually." His voice was soft, almost reverent, and the sincerity in his gaze left me breathless. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it might feel like to shed the weight I'd been carrying, to let someone see me, truly see me, without fear of judgment or rejection. But the thought was terrifying, and I quickly pushed it aside. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I confessed, my throat tight. What if taking it off makes things worse?" Ethan reached out, his hand hovering briefly before resting lightly on my knee. The contact was warm, grounding, and it sent a shiver coursing through me. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said firmly. "One step at a time." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. They weren't just reassurance. They were an invitation, a promise. And though I wasn't ready to accept it fully, I couldn't deny the pull it created within me. The tension between us thickened, charged with unspoken longing and possibility. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, but the silence spoke volumes. Finally, Ethan withdrew his hand, leaning back against the bench with a sigh. "Come on," he said, his tone lighter now, though his eyes still smoldered with intensity. "Let's head back before someone sends out a search party." I nodded, rising to my feet and following him back toward the house. But as we walked, the space between us felt smaller somehow, the distance closing inch by inch. Whatever had shifted during our time alone lingered, wrapping itself around me like a second skin. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I believed. Back inside the house, the mood had shifted again. The remaining guests were clustered in the living room, laughter spilling out in bursts as someone recounted a story involving a misplaced wedding ring and a very confused dog. The warmth of the scene should have been comforting, but instead, it only amplified the storm brewing inside me. Every step I took felt heavier, each interaction layered with an invisible weight I couldn't shake. My mind raced, replaying fragments of the conversation with Ethan on the bench. The way his hand had rested on my knee, the intensity in his gaze, the quiet certainty of his words. It was too much, too fast, and yet not enough that I excused myself early, claiming exhaustion as an excuse to retreat upstairs to my childhood bedroom. The room was unchanged, frozen in time like a museum exhibit dedicated to a version of me that no longer existed. Posters of bands I no longer listened to adorned the walls, and shelves overflowed with books I hadn't touched in years. Everything about it felt foreign, yet achingly familiar. Sitting on the edge of the twin bed, I buried my face in my hands, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume me. What was happening? Was I imagining things, projecting my own desires onto Ethan? Or was there something real between us, something neither of us dared to name? The questions looped endlessly, each one feeding into the next, until I felt dizzy with confusion. Part of me wanted to run, to pack a bag and disappear until the chaos in my head subsided. Another part, the part that scared me most, wanted to march back downstairs, find Ethan, and demand answers. But what if the answers weren't what I hoped for? What if I misread everything, exposing myself only to be rejected? My phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling me out of my spiraling thoughts. It was a text from Mia. "You okay? You vanished pretty quick." Her concern was genuine, but responding felt impossible. How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a vague reply. "Yeah, just tired. Catch you tomorrow." As soon as I hit send, guilt washed over me. Mia had always been supportive, one of the few people who knew about my struggles without needing me to spell them out. She'd never judged me, never pushed me to come out before I was ready. But this tangled mess of feelings for Ethan wasn't something I could share, not even with her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The minutes ticked by, marked by the faint hum of voices drifting up from below. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight with a mixture of longing and dread. Longing for clarity, for connection, for the courage to face whatever lay ahead. Dread of the consequences, of the potential fallout, of the risk of losing something precious. Sleep eluded me, the nights stretching interminably as I wrestled with thoughts I couldn't silence. Hours later, when the house had fallen silent and the partygoers had either left or retired to their respective rooms, I heard soft footsteps padding down the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat, adrenaline surging as I sat up abruptly. The door creaked open, revealing Ethan silhouetted in the doorway, illuminated faintly by the moonlight streaming through the window. He hesitated, his silhouette framed by the pale glow, before stepping inside and closing the door gently behind him. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question was rhetorical. We both knew why he was here, that I shook my head, my pulse pounding in my ears. "No, too much on my mind." Ethan moved closer, his movements deliberate but unhurried. He perched on the edge of the desk across from me, his posture relaxed yet charged with purpose. "Want to talk about it?" The offer hung in the air, heavy with unspoken subtext. I swallowed hard, my throat dry despite the glass of water I'd drunk earlier. "I don't know where to start." "How about the truth?" he suggested, his tone gentle but firm. "Whatever it is, Alex, you can tell me." His words shattered the fragile barrier I'd erected between us. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and unexpected, and I blinked rapidly to hold them back. "It's complicated," I managed, my voice cracking. "I don't even know if I understand it myself." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Try me." The vulnerability in his gaze disarmed me completely. Here was a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing invincible. Yet in this moment, he looked as exposed as I felt. It was that shared fragility, that mutual acknowledgement of imperfection, that gave me the courage to speak. I've been attracted to you for a long time," I confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Not just recently, not just tonight, for years. And I hate it because you're my dad's best friend, because you're older, because it's messy and wrong and—" "Stop." Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp but not unkind. He stood, crossing the short distance between us in 2 strides, and knelt in front of me. His hands gripped my shoulders, steadying me as if I might collapse under the weight of my confession. "None of that matters. None of it." "But it does," I protested, my voice rising despite my efforts to keep it level. "You're supposed to be untouchable, someone I admire from afar, someone I shouldn't even think about this way. And now, I don't know what to do with these feelings or how to make them go away." Ethan's grip tightened slightly, grounding me. "What if you don't have to make them go away?" The question stopped me cold. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or regret. There was none, only resolve and something else, something that made my breath hitch. "What are you saying?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm saying I feel it too," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I felt it for a while, but I didn't want to acknowledge it. Didn't think I had the right to. But sitting out there tonight talking to you, I realized I couldn't keep pretending anymore." Shock rippled through me, followed by a surge of relief so intense it nearly overwhelmed me. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Because if this is just pity or some kind of—" "It's not," he cut in, his tone fierce. "This isn't pity, Alex. It's real. And yes, it's complicated. Yes, it's scary. But I'd rather face it head on than spend another day ignoring what's between us." His words ignited something within me, a spark of defiance and determination. "So what happens now?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands sliding down my arms to rest on my wrists. "Now, we take it one step at a time, together." For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe him, to trust that maybe, just maybe, this could work. that we could navigate the complexities of our connection without losing ourselves or each other in the process. The days that followed the pool party unfolded in a haze of stolen moments and guarded conversations. Ethan and I tiptoed around the edges of our newfound understanding, testing the waters of intimacy while navigating the precarious terrain of secrecy. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, like walking a tightrope suspended high above jagged rocks. Every glance, every touch carried the weight of unspoken truths, and the thrill of discovery was tempered by the constant threat of exposure. During the week, we communicated sparingly, exchanging texts that skirted the boundaries of propriety. "Thinking of you," he'd write, or "Hope you're doing okay." Messages that seemed innocuous to anyone who might stumble upon them, but carried layers of meaning for us. I lived for those brief exchanges, clinging to them like lifelines during the long hours when we were apart. At work, I found myself zoning out during meetings, my mind drifting to memories of his voice, his hands, the way he'd looked at me that night in my bedroom. Colleagues noticed my distraction, commenting on how distant I seemed, but I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses about stress or lack of sleep. Weekends brought opportunities for more substantial encounters, though they were fraught with logistical challenges. We met in public places, coffee shops, parks, bookstores, careful to maintain a facade of casual friendship. These outings were bittersweet, filled with moments of quiet joy punctuated by the anxiety of being seen together. Once, while browsing the shelves of a used bookstore, Ethan brushed his fingers against mine as he reached for a novel. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I glanced around nervously, half expecting someone to accuse us of impropriety. He smiled reassuringly, squeezing my hand briefly before letting go, and I marveled at his ability to remain composed under pressure. Our interactions were tinged with guilt, not just because of the deception, but because of the impact our relationship could have on those around us. My father, in particular, loomed large in my thoughts. He adored Ethan, trusted him implicitly, and viewed him as a brother. The idea of betraying that trust gnawed at me, creating fissures in the foundation of my already fragile self-esteem. What kind of son keeps secrets like this from his father? What kind of person risks destroying a lifelong friendship for the sake of fleeting passion? Ethan, too, wrestled with his own demons. One evening, as we sat in his car parked at the edge of a deserted overlook, he confessed his fears. "I keep thinking about how your dad would react if he found out," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "He's been there for me through everything, my divorce, my darkest days. I owe him so much, and here I am, sneaking around behind his back." "He loves you," I replied softly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "And he loves me. If he understood." "But that's the thing," Ethan interrupted, his tone sharp with frustration. "Would he understand? Or would this destroy everything? I can't lose him, Alex. I can't lose either of you." His words echoed my own fears, crystallizing the enormity of what we were risking. Yet, despite the weight of our circumstances, neither of us could bring ourselves to walk away. The connection between us was too strong, too vital to sever. Instead, we clung to each other, finding solace in the moments we managed to carve out amidst the chaos. It wasn't just the secrecy that strained us. It was the emotional toll of living in limbo. Our relationship existed in a gray area, undefined and uncertain, leaving us both craving clarity while fearing the consequences of pursuing it. Were we merely indulging in a temporary escape, or was this the beginning of something lasting? The ambiguity left me restless, oscillating between hope and despair. At times, I fantasized about coming clean, imagining scenarios where we revealed everything and emerged stronger for it. Other times, I convinced myself that discretion was the only viable option, that some truths were better left unsaid. Through it all, Ethan remained a steady presence, anchoring me when the tide of doubt threatened to pull me under. His patience and empathy were a balm to my frayed nerves, and I clung to him with a desperation I hadn't realized I possessed. Still, the strain showed in subtle ways. The way his smile sometimes faltered, the way his shoulders tensed when we passed acquaintances.